Close your eyes for a moment and picture the story you think you know. A dusty marketplace, a laughing street boy, a magic lamp glowing in the shadows of a cave that seems older than time itself, a genie bursting out in blue smoke, a princess, a palace, a villain whose darkness can be felt through the screen. But tonight, I want to pull the rug out from under that familiar tale. Because the real history of Aladdin, the story told to billions of children across the world, is not Middle Eastern. It's not ancient, and it was never part of the original 1001 Nights. This is the story of a tale that never belonged to any one world. A story that migrated, shape-shifted, and reinvented itself through centuries of misunderstanding, cultural projection, and human longing. A story born not in a desert city but in Paris, under candlelight, in the hands of a French scholar under pressure to deliver more exotic stories to a hungry European audience. Tonight, you're not meeting Aladdin the street boy. You're meeting Aladdin the invention and the real world that unknowingly shaped him. So settle in, because the truth behind this tale is more intricate, more tangled, and far more revealing than the fantasy ever allowed. To understand how deep the mystery goes, we must travel back, far beyond Disney, far beyond Hollywood, to the heart of a literary labyrinth called 1001 Nights. Think of it not as a book, but as a cultural multiverse. No one wrote the nights, no one finished it, and no one, not even scholars today, can point to a single place where it truly began. Instead, it evolved like a living organism. Persian moral tales, Indian animal fables, Arab desert legends, Cairo street stories, Egyptian comedy, Persian romance, Indian philosophy, all drifting together through centuries of trade routes, storytellers, and dynasties. It's the medieval equivalent of a giant writer's room with thousands of anonymous contributors, except the script kept changing every night. The only constant was Shahrazad, the brilliant storyteller whose life depended on cliffhangers, but the stories within her stories, those were fluid, unpredictable, shaped by whoever told them. And that matters, because despite hundreds of versions, hundreds of manuscripts, thousands of oral retellings, none of them included Aladdin, not one, not in Baghdad, not in Cairo, not in Damascus, not in Persia, not in India. The world's most famous Arabian tale simply didn't exist in any Arabic manuscript before 1709, which forces us to confront a question that sounds impossible. How can a story become globally iconic without ever belonging to the culture we think it came from? The answer begins with the storytellers, the real heartbeat of the medieval Islamic world. Back then, stories weren't read. They were performed. In cafes, in bazaars, in small urban squares lit by lanterns and scented with coffee, storytellers improvised their tales like jazz musicians riffing off the crowd's energy. An enthusiast laughing too loudly might inspire a humorous twist. A child leaning in closer might prompt a softer, more magical moment. A merchant dropping a few coins could buy an extra chapter. The nights were never fixed. They were never canon. They evolved the same way American stand-up comedians evolved their sets today, polishing, rewriting, reshaping based on audience reaction. A manuscript was never the original. It was simply the version someone happened to write down at that moment in history, which leads us closer to the mystery we're chasing. If Aladdin never appeared in centuries of Arabic storytelling, if no scribe, no poet, no court scholar, no street storyteller ever preserved it, where did it come from? And why did it suddenly appear in Europe at the exact moment the West became obsessed with imagining a magical, exotic, fantasy version of the East? The answer begins with one Frenchman, one Syrian traveler, and a moment that changed world literature forever. To trace the origins of Aladdin, the version the world knows, we must step into Paris in the early 1700s, a city of salons, candlelit scholarly circles, and a rising European obsession with the mysterious East. And at the center of it all was Antoine Galland, a meticulous French Orientalist, historian, and translator. Galland wasn't a fantasist. He wasn't a playwright or an entertainer. He was a scholar, polite, restrained, methodical. But he was also a man under pressure. In 1704, when he began translating a Syrian manuscript of 1001 Nights into French, Europe fell in love instantly. Readers were mesmerized by these tales of distant cities, enchanted objects, and unpredictable twists. These weren't just stories. They were worlds, exotic, colorful, dangerous, everything Europe wanted the East to be. And suddenly, Galland's publisher smelled gold. More stories, they demanded. More volumes, more nights. Make it a phenomenon. But Galland had a problem. The manuscript he was translating contained far fewer than 1001 nights worth of tales. In fact, it had barely a couple hundred. The rest? They simply didn't exist. So Galland began doing what many creators, studios, and streaming platforms still do today when audiences demand more seasons. He expanded the universe. He started collecting additional stories, some from manuscripts, some from oral storytellers, some from his own imagination. The goal wasn't authenticity. It was to keep readers buying the next volume. And then, in 1709, something extraordinary happened. A traveler arrived in Paris, a man whose footsteps would change the course of literary history. A Syrian Maronite Christian named Hannah Diab. Diab was not a scholar. He wasn't wealthy or powerful. He was something far more dangerous to the European imagination, a natural storyteller. Diab had spent years traveling through the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and North Africa. He had seen bustling ports, merchant caravans, desert bazaars, landscapes Galland only knew through books. More importantly, he carried with him the oral tradition of storytelling passed through generations. When Galland met him, he saw not just a traveler, but a key, a source of new tales, a living gateway to a world European readers desperately craved. Over several meetings, Diab told Galland a series of stories. Galland wrote in his diary, "Today, he told me the tale of Aladdin and the wonderful lamp." But here's where the mystery deepens. There is no Arabic manuscript of Aladdin predating Galland's publication. None. Not in any archive, not in any library, not in any private collection. And Diab himself, in his own autobiography, discovered centuries later, he never once mentions telling Galland the story of Aladdin. So what happened? Did Diab tell it, but simply fail to record it? Did Galland invent the story and attribute it to Diab for legitimacy? Or, most intriguingly, was Aladdin born in the space between them? A hybrid tale shaped by Diab's memories, Galland's imagination, and Europe's hunger for the Orient it wanted to believe in. We will never know for certain. But one thing is clear. Aladdin first appears on Earth, anywhere, in any language, in Galland's French handwriting, not Arabic, not Persian, not Chinese, French. A French construction dressed in Eastern costume. It's the literary equivalent of a Hollywood remake becoming more famous than the original. Except in this case, the original didn't exist at all. And the world didn't question it. Why would they? Europe wanted a magical Eastern fantasy, and Galland delivered. The story spread like wildfire. Within decades, Aladdin became synonymous with Arabian tales, even though no Arab society had ever known him before. But the real tragedy? Hannah Diab, the man who may have created Aladdin, or at least carried its earliest spark, vanished from history. No fame, no royalties, no recognition. A storyteller erased from his own story. Meanwhile, Galland became a literary titan. His version of Aladdin transformed into a global myth, translated, adapted, illustrated, dramatized, and centuries later, turned into one of the most successful animated films ever made. But beneath that glittering palace of adaptations stands a shaky foundation built on academic pressure, cultural projection, and perhaps even a stolen voice. This is where Aladdin's reality begins, not in a cave of wonders, but in a Parisian living room, with two men, two motives, and a tale that would blur the lines between authenticity and invention for the next 300 years. And now that we know how Aladdin entered the world, it's time to explore the world he and the story was imagined to belong to. When readers first encountered Aladdin and the wonderful lamp in 1709, one detail immediately stood out, and still confuses audiences today. Gallen's version claims the story takes place in China, not Arabia, not Persia, not Baghdad. Not any place remotely connected to the cultural world the story feels like it belongs to, China. But the characters pray in mosques. They follow Islamic customs. Their political system resembles an Islamic sultanate. Their names are Arab or Persian. So what on earth was Gallen doing? To understand that contradiction, we need to imagine the Silk Road not as a line on a map, but as a living, breathing organism. A massive network of cities where identities blurred, stories fused, and worlds collided. For nearly 1,000 years, merchants, monks, scholars, soldiers, and storytellers traveled from one end of Asia to the other. Along these routes were hybrid cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, places where you might see a Persian rug next to Chinese porcelain, where Arabic script decorated buildings shaped by Central Asian design, where a Muslim ruler might employ Buddhist, Christian, and Zoroastrian advisors. Cultures didn't clash. They blended. This was the environment where stories traveled too, slipping between languages, picking up new elements, shedding old ones, transforming just as fluidly as the merchants who carried them. So when Gallen wrote that Aladdin lived in one of the cities of China, he may have been drawing on a very real cultural memory, the frontier zones where Chinese and Islamic civilizations met and mixed. To Europeans in 1709, China didn't necessarily mean the geographic empire we know today. It meant far away. It meant exotic. It meant beyond comprehension. Calling Aladdin Chinese served the same purpose as placing a modern fantasy in a galaxy far, far away. It signaled to readers that they were entering a mythical space, not a documentary. But even more importantly, the story feels Islamic because it was built from fragments of Islamic oral culture, or at least from European fantasies of it. The Sultan's court, the separation of elite women into secluded quarters, the bustling bazaar, the magician whose knowledge of the occult blends Quranic cosmology with Persian alchemical lore. These details aren't Chinese. They're not necessarily Syrian either. They're a fusion, a silhouette of the Islamic world as imagined through centuries of trade, storytelling, and eventually European appropriation. Aladdin is not a product of one culture. It is the child of many. A Chinese facade, an Islamic backbone, Persian influences, European literary styling, and Silk Road imagination tying it all together. In many ways, Aladdin represents something profoundly modern, a global story born long before globalization. Stories in the medieval world didn't respect borders. They moved like wind, shifting shape depending on who told them and where. An Indian tale might travel west and become Persian. A Persian scene might pick up Arabic motifs. A Central Asian legend might reflect Buddhist morals in one city and Islamic philosophy in another. The reason Aladdin feels familiar to so many cultures is because it never belonged exclusively to any of them. It was built between cultures. Perhaps that is why it survived. Because a story without a single homeland can be adopted by every culture that encounters it. It belonged to no one, which allowed it to belong to everyone. But there's a deeper truth hiding beneath the confusion of this hybrid origin. Europe wasn't simply receiving a story, it was reshaping it intentionally or not, into a fantasy version of the East that satisfied Western expectations. The exotic city that looks Islamic but is called Chinese, the sorcerer with North African roots, the palace that reflects Persian aesthetics, the princess whose constraints mirror Ottoman gender norms. This was not authenticity. This was collage. A mosaic assembled from whatever cultural fragments Galland had access to, or thought his readers would enjoy. And while that hybrid quality made the story irresistible, it also laid the foundation for centuries of Orientalism. The West's habit of imagining the East as a single, mysterious, magical place instead of a diverse and complex set of civilizations. Aladdin didn't just reflect Orientalism, it helped create it. Before Disney. Before Hollywood. Before Victorian pantomimes. Before the illustrated editions that shaped Western imagery. Aladdin was already a fantasy of the East, crafted by a Frenchman, possibly inspired by a Syrian traveler, and shaped by centuries of Silk Road imagination. And that fantasy would soon collide with the real medieval Islamic world, a world far more sophisticated, scientific, and cosmopolitan than the fairy tale allowed. That's where we go next. If the world of Aladdin had a real birthplace, a cultural oxygen source that breathed life into its palaces, bazaars, and visions of magic, that place wasn't China. It wasn't even Syria. It was Baghdad. Not the Baghdad of modern images shaped by conflict, but the Baghdad of 1,000 years ago, a city so advanced, so wealthy, so brilliantly alive that European visitors described it as unimaginable wealth made real. Imagine this, a city of nearly 1 million people at a time when London had only 20,000. A circular metropolis engineered with mathematical precision, its architecture radiating outward from a golden palace like the gears of an astronomical clock. Rivers feeding gardens, markets humming day and night, scholars, merchants, architects, poets, and astronomers all sharing the same streets. Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate wasn't just a city. It was the Silicon Valley of the medieval world. It produced knowledge the way modern tech hubs produce apps. And the heart of this intellectual engine was the legendary House of Wisdom, part library, part research institute, part translation center. It was here that scholars translated Greek philosophy, Persian astronomy, Indian mathematics, and classical medicine into Arabic. Not merely copying texts, but expanding them. Algebra, born here. Much of modern medicine, refined here. Astronomy so advanced that Islamic scholars calculated the Earth's circumference within 200 miles of the actual value, achieved here. While Europe struggled through the Dark Ages, Baghdad was lit with the glow of scientific discovery. And yet the version of the East that reached Europe through tales like Aladdin was not one of scholars and scientists. It was one of sorcerers, jinn, treasure caves, and palaces built overnight. Fantasy replaced reality, not because the truth was dull, but because the truth was inconvenient. It contradicted Europe's self-image as the world's intellectual center. But step inside a medieval Islamic marketplace, the kind Aladdin's world imitates, and you'd see a different story. A crowded network of merchants selling Turkish textiles, Chinese porcelain, Yemeni coffee, Persian carpets, African ivory, Indian spices. Craft guilds regulated trade. Prices were negotiated loudly, boldly. News spread faster in bazaars than in royal courts. It was chaotic, yes, but structured, vibrant, but sophisticated, and nothing like the caricatured, barbaric markets depicted in Western films centuries later. The palace life Galland describes, the etiquette, the hierarchy, the layers of protocol, reflected real Islamic courts. But even there, reality diverges sharply from fantasy. Sultans weren't whimsical tyrants granting marriages on a whim. They were political strategists balancing tribal alliances, military factions, and economic interests. Princesses weren't silent, decorative figures locked in towers. Many were educated, influential, sometimes even political power brokers. Yet when these cultural elements traveled to Europe through stories like Aladdin, they were flattened, simplified, turned into exotic tropes. Why? Because for Europeans of the 18th century, the Islamic world was both a rival and an enigma. Baghdad's scientific knowledge had once overshadowed Europe. Islamic Spain had produced medical and philosophical works that shaped European universities. Ottoman armies sat at the gates of Vienna less than a century before Galland. The West needed the East to be magical, not intellectual, mysterious, not modern, exotic, not equal. And so, elements of this real civilization filtered into Aladdin, but were twisted into fantasy. Domes and minarets became symbols of exotic wonder, not architectural innovation. Quests for knowledge became quests for magical artifacts. Scholars became sorcerers. Scientific exploration morphed into mystical rituals. Social hierarchy turned into simplified fairy tale class divisions. By the time Aladdin reached European readers, the real Islamic world had been replaced by a vibrant illusion. A world designed not to reflect reality, but to satisfy Western imagination. And yet, within that illusion lies a deeper truth. Fantasy persists, not because it replaces history, but because it borrows just enough from it to feel real. Aladdin's world is not Baghdad, but it is a shadow of Baghdad, refracted through centuries of storytelling, cultural misunderstanding, and narrative desire. And nowhere is that blending clearer than in Aladdin's most iconic element, the genie, a creature Europeans saw as pure fantasy, but whose roots lie deep in Islamic theology, folklore, and occult science. That is where our story turns next. Before Disney turned the genie into a blue, wisecracking comedian, before Victorian theater made him a puff of stage smoke, before Galland inked the first French version of Aladdin, the jinn were already ancient. Older than Islam, older than the Arabian Nights, older even than the civilizations that first whispered about them under desert stars. To understand Aladdin, you must understand what Europeans never did. The genie is not a fantasy creature. It is a theological being. Picture the world as medieval Islamic cosmology saw it. Three intelligent creations. The angels made of light, the humans made of clay, and the jinn, beings forged from smokeless fire. They lived parallel to humans, invisible, yet everywhere, capable of great good or catastrophic harm. And unlike angels, the jinn had free will. They could choose, they could rebel, they could deceive. This wasn't superstition, this was doctrine. The Quran speaks of jinn more than a dozen times. Their leader, Iblis, is a jinn, not a fallen angel, who refused to bow to Adam. His followers, the shayateen, roam the world tempting humans. So when Europeans read Galland's Genie in a Lamp, they saw a magical servant. But Arab audiences heard something far older, far deeper. They heard danger, because in Islamic folklore, jinn are not cute. They are not bubbly sidekicks. They do not grant 3 wishes and crack jokes. They are unpredictable, morally ambiguous, often hostile. They can attach themselves to houses, deserts, abandoned wells. They can whisper misguidance. They can help you one moment and destroy you the next. And yes, scholars believed they could be bound, not by rubbing a lamp, not by cartoon rules, but through names, seals, geometry, and ritual. According to medieval magical texts, the greatest jinn master who ever lived was King Solomon, Suleiman, who commanded legions of supernatural beings with a signet ring engraved with divine symbols. Stories say the jinn built Solomon's temples, dove beneath the sea for treasure, and performed tasks impossible for humans. This mythology shaped the idea of forced servitude, which later storytellers transformed into the genie we know. But in real magical practice, binding a jinn came at a cost. To summon one, you needed ritual purity. You needed the correct planetary hour. You needed geometric diagrams drawn in saffron ink. You needed to recite names of God, not as superstition, but as cosmic architecture. Medieval Islamic grimoires were astonishingly technical, filled with star charts, mathematical ratios, coded invocations. Compared to them, Aladdin's lamp is child's play. Yet if you look closely, the echoes are there. The ring Aladdin wears, that's straight from Solomonic tradition. The jinn obeying the lamp's owner, a dramatized version of binding magic. The underground treasure cavern, common in jinn lore, where spirits guard hidden wealth. The sorcerer, a North African magus, exactly the region medieval Muslims associated with powerful occultists. Galland didn't invent these pieces. He stitched them together, like a tailor sewing fragments of real belief into a costume of fantasy. But Western audiences misunderstood what they were seeing. To them, jinn became genies, spirits with personalities, wish-granters with limits, servants defined by rules of convenience. They took a complex metaphysical tradition and simplified it into folklore. And perhaps the largest distortion came from the most beloved element: the 3 wishes. There is no such rule in Islamic belief. No magical text limits jinn to a numbered set of favors. That idea comes from European folk tales. Fairy godmothers, enchanted fish, devil bargains. Galland blended Western story logic with Eastern cosmology, and in doing so created a creature that belonged to neither world completely. But if the Western imagination softened the jinn, Islamic folklore kept them sharp. Stories warn of jinn disguised as animals. Black dogs, snakes, goats, of jinn who haunt ruins and deserts, of jinn who fall in love with humans, of jinn who trick magicians, answering commands literally but maliciously. A jinn granted treasure, it might bury it instantly after giving it. A jinn asked to protect your home, it might destroy anyone who enters, including your family. The underlying message: power borrowed from jinn is always dangerous. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Is Aladdin's magical success heroic? Or is it a moral danger disguised as a gift? In the original tale, the lamp does not reward virtue. It rewards possession. It rewards power. And for centuries, audiences cheered, without realizing they were watching a horror story softened into a fairy tale. Because in real Islamic folklore, jinn serve no one willingly. They obey because they must, because a seal forces them, because a command binds them. What European translators turned into wonder, Muslim readers recognized as peril, and that tension between awe and fear is what gives Aladdin its strange energy. Magic here is not whimsical. It is cosmic negotiation, a pact, a struggle between worlds, and nowhere is that tension more visible than in the next chapter, when we examine the story Galland actually wrote. The true Aladdin, not the Disney hero, not the Victorian charmer, but the morally ambiguous street boy whose rise to power says far more about humanity than magic ever could. If you think you know Aladdin, pause. Erase every image Disney ever gave you: the parkour street rat, the sassy genie, the tiger-guarded princess. Now imagine something far more unsettling, because the first written Aladdin, the one Antoine Galland published in 1709, wasn't the story of a lovable underdog. It was a folktale stitched from mystery, danger, and moral ambiguity. Let's step into that world. It begins not in Arabia, not in Baghdad, but in China, or at least a version of China only medieval storytellers could imagine. A city that looks Islamic, sounds Islamic, and behaves like the Middle East, but is labeled China nevertheless. Imagine a map drawn by someone who never saw the Far East, but heard rumors of distant kingdoms and folded them together like a dream. This is where Aladdin lives, a boy not heroic but hopeless. Aladdin in Galen's tale is lazy. He skips work. He wanders the streets with other idle boys. His father, a humble tailor, dies of shame because his son refuses to learn a trade. This isn't the story of a diamond in the rough. It's the story of a boy who has no rough and no diamond, only wasted potential. His mother is exhausted, grieving, spinning cotton late into the night just so they can eat. She loves her son, but she knows he is drifting, stuck, trapped in poverty not by fate, but by inertia. And then one day, a stranger appears. A North African magician, not a comical villain, but a truly dangerous man, arrives claiming to be Aladdin's long-lost uncle. He offers gifts, fine clothes, money, attention. He does what predators do. He identifies the vulnerable and fills their emptiness with promises. Aladdin's mother, desperate for relief, believes him. Aladdin, flattered, follows him willingly. The magician leads the boy miles outside the city, into an empty valley, quiet, desolate, unsettling. He performs a ritual. The ground trembles. A hidden stone door scrapes open. Below lies a cavern of wonders. But this is no Disney cave of wonders. It's a labyrinth lit by an eerie glow, filled with trees bearing jeweled fruit, rubies disguised as apples, emeralds as pears, diamonds as plump grapes. Aladdin pockets them, not knowing they're worth kingdoms. He just thinks they look pretty. At the far end, hanging from a hook, is the lamp. The magician orders him, "Bring me the lamp, but touch nothing else." Aladdin insists on being helped out first. The magician snaps, and in an instant, the mask falls. He doesn't care about the boy. He cares about the lamp. When Aladdin refuses to hand it over, the magician slams the stone door shut, sealing the boy alive underground. No music. No comic relief, just darkness, silence, panic. Hours pass. Aladdin sobs, rubs his hands in despair, and accidentally strokes the ring the magician gave him. A jinn appears, dark, towering, not cartoonish, but terrifying. "What do you command?" Aladdin, trembling, whispers the only thing a dying boy would say. "Get me out." He wakes in his mother's arms. For days, she thinks he has lost his mind. A lamp, a cavern, jewels growing on trees, she dismisses it as fever, until she scrubs the lamp, and a second jinn erupts, far more powerful than the one from the ring. This jinn doesn't joke. It roars. Its presence fills the house like a storm. Aladdin faints. His mother collapses. And just like that, their lives change. Food appears. Silver platters materialize. They survive by selling the dishes piece by piece. But wealth breeds ambition. One day Aladdin sees the Sultan's daughter through a rare break in palace veils. Just a glimpse, but it burns into him. He decides he will marry her. Not hopes, not dreams, decides. And he uses magic to make it happen. Gifts of impossible jewels. Servants conjured from thin air. A palace built overnight. Taller, brighter, richer than the Sultan's own. But here's the part modern adaptations never tell. Aladdin ruins another man's marriage to get the princess. The vizier's son is originally engaged to her. On their wedding night, Aladdin commands the jinn to abduct the couple and freeze them in a dark room until dawn. He does this twice. Not heroic, not noble, but effective. And Galen does not condemn him for it. When the evil magician returns, this time disguised as a merchant, trading new lamps for old, the princess innocently hands over the lamp. Her ignorance triggers catastrophe. The palace vanishes overnight. She is kidnapped. The Sultan blames Aladdin. The ring jinn sends Aladdin across continents to rescue her. There, in a foreign land, the princess poisons the magician, not out of empowerment, but because Aladdin instructs her to. A second magician comes, disguised as a holy woman. He attempts to kill Aladdin, until Aladdin slays him first. Only then does the story return to comfort, wealth, stability, power, and succession. But the journey, it's chaotic, morally gray, and profoundly human. This is the real Aladdin, a story not about virtue rewarded, but about what people do when given power they never earned. Before Hollywood. Before Disney, before Aladdin became a symbol of magic and innocence, the West was already rewriting the East, and not with accuracy, but with imagination, power, and desire. To understand why Aladdin became the Western image of the Middle East, you must understand a word that changed scholarship forever: Orientalism. It sounds academic, but its impact is personal, shaping how millions of people view an entire region even today. So let's slow down and step into Europe of the 1700s. Imagine candlelit salons in Paris, wealthy elites lounging on velvet chairs, sipping wine, craving stories from lands they would never see. Then Galland releases The Arabian Nights, and Europe explodes. Exotic fabrics, Turkish rooms, camel motifs carved into furniture, people redecorate their homes as if the Middle East were a lifestyle brand. But what they were consuming wasn't the real Middle East. It was a fantasy, soft enough to be comfortable, strange enough to be exciting. Aladdin fit perfectly. Magic lamps, flying carpets, desert villains, domed palaces shimmering under starlight. It confirmed every Western expectation of the mysterious East. But here's the twist. The West didn't just misinterpret the East, it needed the East to be mysterious. Because mystery creates distance, and distance creates power. By imagining the Arab and Islamic world as irrational, magical, and backward, Europe positioned itself as rational, modern, superior. Aladdin wasn't just entertainment, it was evidence, or at least it felt like evidence, that the East was fundamentally different, exotic, emotional, unpredictable, a place of wonders and of dangers. Through art, literature, and early theater, the Middle East became a mirror reflecting everything Europe wanted and feared. Women behind veils, symbols of fantasy and imprisonment. Tyrannical sultans, warnings about foreign despotism. Sprawling bazaars painted as chaotic and dishonest. Magic portrayed as the opposite of Western science. Reality didn't matter. The fantasy was more useful. By the 1800s, Orientalism went from trend to industry. Painters traveled to North Africa and returned with canvases filled with sensual harems and violent marketplaces. Never mind that many never actually saw these scenes. Travel writers exaggerated what they witnessed, turning nuances into stereotypes. Aladdin's world took shape from these distortions. The city of Agrabah, or its earlier stage versions, wasn't modeled on Baghdad or Damascus or Cairo. It was modeled on Europe's imagination of all three mixed together. To Western audiences, domes meant Islam, turban meant Orient, magic meant East. Accuracy became irrelevant. And as Europe expanded its colonies into Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, and beyond, Orientalism gained darker purpose. A colonized people are easier to control when portrayed as backward or strange. If they're irrational, the West must guide them. If they're chaotic, the West must stabilize them. If their culture is primitive, the West must civilize them. Aladdin was not the cause of this mindset, but it was one of its most successful messengers. When Victorian England adopted Aladdin as a Christmas pantomime, the story changed again. Gone was the moral ambiguity. Gone was the complex world of Islamic culture. In its place, cross-dressing comedy, slapstick, colorful props, simplified morals, and a sanitized Orient designed to be fun, not real. But beneath the fun was a subtle lesson. The East is beautiful, but childish, exotic, but chaotic, magical, but morally simple. A place to visit, not a place to respect. By the time early Hollywood picked up the tale, the visual vocabulary was already locked in. Sand dunes, palace domes, sinister viziers, sword fights, belly dancers, bustling bazaars. Even the accents became standardized. Thick, heavy, foreign, even when the hero himself sounded American. Villains, darker skin, harsher accents. Heroes, lighter skin, American speech patterns, subtle, but powerful. Disney's 1992, Aladdin amplified these codes with blockbuster energy. Robin Williams' Genie made the film unforgettable, but the world he existed in, Agrabah, continued the fantasy Orient legacy. Arab-American groups immediately pushed back. Lyrics like, "They cut off your ear if they don't like your face," weren't just inaccurate, they were damaging. Because stereotypes in children's films don't fade, they settle, they root, they define normal. And for millions who never met a Muslim or Arab person, these images became their first, and sometimes only, reference point. That's the power of Orientalism. Not loud, not violent, but slow and cumulative. 1,000 tiny distortions that feel harmless, until they aren't. Yet awareness began to grow. Critics demanded better representation. Arab and Middle Eastern creators reclaimed their stories. Disney revised lyrics and produced a more culturally mindful remake in 2019. But even that remake, with all its improvements, still lived inside a fantasy Orient frame built long before any of us were born. The truth is simple. Aladdin can't escape Orientalism entirely, because it was born from it. But that doesn't mean we can't watch it. It means we watch with open eyes. We understand what's real, what's fiction, what's harmless, what's harmful. And in doing so, we honor the real cultures behind the tale, not the ones Europe invented. If you've ever wondered why Aladdin is supposedly set in China, yet looks unmistakably Middle Eastern, with Islamic customs but Chinese geography, Persian-style magic but Arab names, you're not alone. For centuries, scholars have scratched their heads at the story's cultural confusion. But to understand this strange mix, this geographic glitch, you have to picture something far bigger than any single civilization. The Silk Road. Not a road, but an entire world system of movement, of people, goods, beliefs, and stories flowing back and forth for over 1,000 years. Imagine standing in a bustling Silk Road city like Samarkand or Kashgar during its peak. You'd hear 10 languages before noon. You'd smell spices from India, watch caravans from Persia arrive under clouds of dust, and see Chinese silk traders bargaining with Arab merchants over porcelain, pearls, and silver ingots. This world was not divided by clean borders. It was a cultural blender. And stories, the cheapest cargo, the easiest to carry, flowed more freely than anything else. Aladdin makes sense only inside this world, because on the Silk Road, China didn't mean China the way we imagine today. To Middle Eastern storytellers, China could mean the farthest east they could imagine, a metaphor for wealth and distance, or any land beyond Persia. Likewise, Islamic culture didn't stay in the Middle East. It stretched deep into Central Asia, into regions where Muslims, Chinese, Turkic nomads, and Persian scholars lived side by side. A tale could begin in India, gain Islamic elements in Persia, pick up Chinese imagery along the road, then arrive in Damascus, where a Syrian storyteller adds his own flavor before telling it to Antoine Galland in Paris. It's not a glitch. It's a product of the world that created it. Silk Road cities were global long before the modern world ever claimed that word. Let's walk through one. Picture Samarkand in the 12th century. Turquoise domes glinting under the sun, narrow streets echoing with traders shouting prices, courtyards filled with mathematicians, poets, and Sufi mystics debating under carved wooden eaves. A Persian merchant tells a story to pass the time. A Chinese traveler adds a magical creature. A Central Asian storyteller inserts a clever hero. A Muslim scholar adds moral framing. A local boy remembers the tale and retells it slightly differently. This is how Aladdin could be Chinese and Islamic at the same time, because on the Silk Road, identities mixed effortlessly. But there's another layer. Hybrid cities create hybrid people. Hybrid people create hybrid stories. And Aladdin is exactly that. A Chinese city with a sultan instead of an emperor. Islamic customs in a place that shouldn't have them. A magician from North Africa, thousands of miles away. Jewels growing on trees, an Indian motif. A magical ring and lamp, pulled from Jewish, Christian, and Islamic demonological traditions. Themes of social mobility, rooted in Persian folktales. A poor youth rising through luck, classic Central Asian storytelling. It's a cultural mosaic, not a map. So when we criticize Aladdin for having inaccurate geography, we're applying modern expectations to a pre-modern storytelling world where accuracy wasn't the point. The point was wonder, distance, transformation. If you said a tale happened in China, it simply meant, this story takes place far beyond your understanding, where anything is possible. The same way modern storytellers say, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Geography wasn't literal. It was emotional. The themes themselves, movement, trade, sudden fortune, hidden treasure, strangers arriving from distant lands, reflect everything the Silk Road represented. Merchants often became wealthy overnight by finding the right buyer. Travelers carried rumors of buried treasure. Magic wasn't entertainment. It was believed to be part of the unseen world. Strangers were exciting and terrifying at the same time. And then there was danger. The Silk Road wasn't a peaceful highway. Bandits roamed deserts. Rival empires taxed caravans heavily. Merchant families guarded their wealth like royal treasures. The idea of a treasure hidden underground guarded by magic, that wasn't fantasy, that was memory. For centuries, merchants buried valuables along routes during travel, marking spots only they could find again. Many died on the road. Their treasure stayed underground, waiting for anyone brave or foolish enough to stumble upon it. Now the Cave of Wonders makes sense. Now the magician makes sense. Now the Ring of Protection makes sense. Aladdin wasn't set in a real place because it wasn't about reality. It was about the Silk Road itself, the crossroads where worlds collided, where stories mutated, where nothing stayed local for long. The story has no homeland because its homeland is exchange. This is why Aladdin feels familiar to every culture it touches. It was designed that way, shaped by centuries of travelers passing it like a lantern from caravan to caravan. A Syrian storyteller may have given it to Galland. But the story itself? It carries fingerprints from half the world, and that's why it survives. A tale that belongs everywhere, because it was born nowhere. If you ever needed proof that stories don't stay in one culture forever, look no further than this chapter. The British took Aladdin, a hybrid Silk Road tale, and turned it into a Christmas family comedy. Yes, Christmas. This might be the strangest transformation in Aladdin's 300-year journey. But once you understand Victorian England, the shift makes perfect sense. Let's rewind to the early 1800s. Britain is booming with industrialization, global trade, and imperial expansion. Families crave entertainment that distracts them from brutal working conditions, polluted cities, and social upheaval. Into this world comes the pantomime, the biggest theatrical phenomenon of Victorian popular culture. A chaotic blend of slapstick comedy, music hall singing, audience participation, over-the-top costumes, inside jokes about British politics, and magical transformations using cutting-edge stage machinery. Pantomimes were performed every December, becoming as essential to British Christmas as carols or plum pudding. They needed stories with simple morals, clear heroes, flashy magic, exotic settings, and huge potential for comedy and spectacle. And which tale fit all those needs perfectly? Aladdin. Not Galland's Aladdin. Not the morally ambiguous street kid from the Chinese Islamic hybrid city. No. Victorian England rebuilt Aladdin from the ground up to fit its own imagination. Let's break down how drastically they changed it, and why these changes still shape modern versions today. In classic British pantomime tradition, the principal boy, the young male hero, was always played by a woman in tights, a costume that allowed Victorian audiences to see something considered scandalous at the time: a woman's legs. So for nearly a century, Aladdin wasn't just misrepresented. He was literally gender-bent on purpose. Audiences loved it. It added playfulness. It added charm. It added flirtation. And it made Aladdin feel less like a Middle Eastern folktale and more like British holiday fun. Enter Widow Twankey, a character that never existed in any Arabic, Persian, or earlier manuscript. She was invented purely for comedy. Played by a man in exaggerated makeup, big wigs, and colorful dresses. She cracked jokes, slipped on soap suds, flirted with the audience, and often stole the show. This single change transformed Aladdin into a fundamentally British form of entertainment, part family show, part social satire, part comedy routine. Pantomimes updated their music every year. A single Aladdin show in 1870 might include a folk tune, a parody of an opera aria, a popular tavern song, and improvised comedy verses. By the 1920s, Aladdin pantomimes included jazz numbers. By the 1960s, rock and roll. Today they feature Bruno Mars, Taylor Swift, and whatever else crowds recognize. So Aladdin's sound constantly evolved, but never sounded Middle Eastern. This shaped Western expectations for the story. Aladdin wasn't foreign. It was familiar fun. Victorian set designers didn't care about authenticity. They cared about spectacle. So Aladdin's world became a collage of stereotypes. Chinese pagodas next to Islamic minarets, lanterns from Japanese prints, Persian carpets, Indian elephants, and British humor sprinkled everywhere. Agrabah, the fictional city Disney later popularized, is heavily inspired by these Victorian mashups. The goal wasn't realism, the goal was exotic delight. Victorian audiences didn't want a morally gray hero who terrorizes a rival groom or manipulates a princess, so they softened him. Aladdin became earnest, kind, hard-working, destined for greatness. The rough edges vanished. The selfishness vanished. The ambition softened into innocence. This gentle Aladdin is the one that influenced Hollywood and, eventually, Disney. Victorian theaters loved special effects, trapdoors, flying rigs, mechanical dragons, disappearing sets, instantaneous costume changes, magical transformations, mid-scene. Aladdin offered endless opportunities for stage magic. The lamp reveal, the genie's entrance, the palace appearing overnight, Aladdin flying across the stage, treasure caves opening with explosions of light. The spectacle became the selling point, and for decades the name Aladdin simply meant a guaranteed good time at Christmas. The truly wild part? Millions in Britain today still grow up watching Aladdin every December, not as Middle Eastern culture, not as a folktale, not as literature, but as holiday entertainment filled with jokes about British politics and pop culture. And this version became so deeply rooted that when Disney adapted Aladdin in 1992, the animators and writers were influenced not only by Gallen's story, but also by 150 years of British pantomime tradition. That's why we have comedy sidekicks, slapstick pacing, musical numbers, simplified villains, a strong romantic arc, and a world that feels broadly Eastern rather than specific. Disney didn't just adapt Aladdin. They adapted Aladdin as reinvented by Britain. A story born on the Silk Road, rewritten in France, reshaped by British theater, and globalized by Hollywood. By the time Aladdin reached the United States, it had already lived a dozen different lives: Silk Road tale, French invention, British Christmas comedy. But Hollywood was about to give the story its most powerful transformation yet. To understand how deeply Hollywood reshaped Aladdin, We need to see it not as a single film, but as a century-long evolution. In early cinema, Aladdin was gold. Why? Because silent films relied on visual extravagance, fantasy costumes, dramatic gestures, magical transformations, exotic scenery, and Aladdin delivered all of that. One of the earliest blockbusters, The Thief of Baghdad, 1924, wasn't even an Aladdin movie, but it felt like one. Flying carpets, magical creatures, jeweled palaces, all borrowed from the same fantasy-orient universe that Galland had helped create centuries earlier. This film became the blueprint for Hollywood's Arabian fantasy aesthetic. Shimmering domes, swirling fabrics, golden oil lamps, smoky genie apparitions, heroic thieves with charming smiles. America fell in love with a world that never existed, but looked amazing on screen. As Hollywood entered its Technicolor era, filmmakers doubled down on exotic fantasy. Movies like Arabian Nights, 1942, and Sinbad films weren't adaptations of real Middle Eastern stories. They were Western fantasies decorated with Eastern motifs, turbans, palaces, veils, sword dances, glued onto thin plots. These films cemented stereotypes: villains with dark eyeliner and sinister accents, mystical deserts as places of danger, belly dancers as background decoration, heroic men rescuing silent women, jinn as monstrous or comedic servants. Aladdin didn't have a new adaptation yet. But the world he would eventually inhabit was being built piece by piece. Hollywood wasn't adapting the Middle East. Hollywood was adapting Hollywood's version of the Middle East. Before Disney, American TV quietly reshaped genie culture. Most famously, I Dream of Jeannie, a sitcom where a blonde genie in a pink costume calls her male master, played for laughs. It was cute, it was charming, it was harmless fun. But it also normalized the genie as a comedic figure, a wish-granting cheerleader, a bubbly servant with magical loyalty. This set the stage for the biggest transformation of all. Then came Aladdin, 1992. Not just a success, but a cultural supernova. Robin Williams didn't just voice the genie, he detonated the character into American pop mythology. Until this moment, genies in Western culture were mysterious, dangerous, unpredictable, morally ambiguous. Williams turned the genie into a comedian, a best friend, a moral guide, a symbol of freedom, and the emotional core of the story. This single creative decision rewrote centuries of folklore. For millions of viewers, the genie became Robin Williams, funny, warm, loyal, explosive, endearing. It was the most significant reinterpretation of a supernatural being since Hollywood reshaped vampires and werewolves. But Disney didn't stop there. Disney rebuilt every pillar of the tale. Aladdin becomes the underdog hero, kind, clever, morally grounded, a complete reversal of the original's selfishly ambitious boy. Jasmine becomes outspoken and empowered. Not a political asset, but a young woman fighting for agency. Jafar becomes a sleek political villain. Rather than a wandering North African magician, he becomes a court power seeker, fitting modern American storytelling tropes. Agrabah becomes a fantasy kingdom, not Chinese, not Middle Eastern, not historical, a collage built for global audiences. The message becomes American. Follow your heart. Be yourself. Love conquers status. Freedom is the ultimate wish. None of these appear in Galland's version, but all of them resonate with American values of the 90s. This wasn't an adaptation, it was a reinvention, and it worked. Disney's Aladdin also triggered outrage. Lyrics like, "Where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face," were condemned as racist. Arab American groups protested the accent coding, heroes with American voices, villains with heavy ethnic accents. Skin tones were noticeably lighter for heroes and darker for villains. characters blended dozens of cultures into one fantasy Middle East. Disney edited the lyrics, but the debate reshaped how America talked about representation. Aladdin wasn't just entertainment anymore. It became a cultural battlefield. Nearly 30 years later, Disney released a version trying to address the past. A more diverse cast, more explicit Middle Eastern and South Asian influences, Jasmine rewritten as politically active, Jafar reframed through psychology rather than villain tropes, cultural advisors hired for sensitivity. It wasn't perfect, but it was aware. Something earlier versions never were. Aladdin had become more than a story. It had become a reflection of America's evolving relationship with race, power, and representation on screen. Aladdin's Hollywood journey is the most visible transformation the tale has ever undergone. But it's not the only one, because while America was reinventing the genie, the Middle East was responding, proudly, angrily, creatively, and that's where we go next. For centuries, Aladdin floated freely between cultures, a story without a country, a tale that didn't belong to anyone. But once Disney turned it into a global icon, something unexpected happened. Millions of people in the Middle East and North Africa began seeing a version of themselves reflected on screen. And they didn't always like what they saw. Some felt pride. Some felt nostalgia. Some felt anger. Most felt complicated emotions that couldn't be summed up by any one reaction. Because the truth is this: Aladdin became one of the most widely recognized Arab stories in the world, even though it was never originally Arab. And that paradox sits at the heart of the Middle Eastern response. For many in the Arab world, the Disney film of 1992 wasn't foreign. It was familiar. It had desert landscapes, bustling bazaars, domes and minarets, music with Middle Eastern motifs, a hero who looked vaguely like them, and a princess who reminded them of cultural beauty standards. Even if the film was inaccurate, people embraced its emotional resonance. In Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, children watched Aladdin in dubbed Arabic and felt something rare. Someone like us is the hero. In a global media landscape dominated by Western characters, this mattered. For decades, Middle Eastern viewers had been stereotyped as terrorists, villains, oil sheikhs, or background extras. Suddenly, a charming, lovable protagonist emerged. Brown-skinned, adventurous, morally good. For many families, Aladdin became part of childhood, part of nostalgia, part of cultural memory. Even when they knew it wasn't authentically Arab, they still loved it. But that love came with a shadow. As children grew up, awareness grew too. Academics, activists, and creators began pointing out distortions. Accents coded for morality. Heroes spoke in clean American English. Villains spoke in exaggerated Arab-like accents. The message was subtle but powerful. Skin tone hierarchy, lighter skin for protagonists, darker tones for antagonists. Stereotyped imagery. Agrabah wasn't real, but it borrowed real Middle Eastern aesthetics and exaggerated them into something dangerous, chaotic, lawless. Many Middle Eastern viewers realized we're being portrayed as fantasy caricatures. And worse, billions of people around the world were consuming this as the default image of Middle Eastern culture. Some critics go further. For them, Aladdin isn't harmless fantasy. It's part of a long pattern of Western storytelling that romanticizes the East while flattening its people into tropes. They argue, Aladdin reinforces old colonial stereotypes, mixes dozens of cultures into one fictional Middle East, sells Western fantasies as representation, ignores historical depth and complexity, rewrites Arab, Persian, and Islamic cultures into exotic spectacle. They point out scenes like, "They cut off your ear if they don't like your face," implying barbarism. Jafar's darker features compared to Aladdin's lighter complexion. Agrabah framed as dangerous unless civilized by Western morality. To them, Aladdin isn't a celebration. It's a reminder of how Western media has shaped global perceptions of the Middle East for centuries. In the last decade, a shift has begun. Middle Eastern writers, filmmakers, scholars, and artists have started reclaiming Aladdin, not to correct its origin, but to own its narrative going forward. For example, Arab novelists writing reimagined versions. Some explore the story from Jasmine's perspective. Some retell it through historical Arabian cities. Some create darker, politically charged reinterpretations. Regional filmmakers experimenting with grounded adaptations. What if Aladdin took place in Abbasid Baghdad, or in Ottoman Damascus, or in pre-colonial North Africa? Scholars publishing research uncovering deeper folklore roots, tracing motifs that truly originate from Arabic and Islamic storytelling traditions, even if Aladdin itself does not. Social media creators explaining Orientalism to new generations, breaking down stereotypes, reframing the story. Adding context Disney never gave. Fans blending nostalgia with critique, loving the childhood magic, but demanding better representation now. This is the most powerful form of cultural response, not rejection, not imitation, but transformation, a decision to participate in the story rather than be defined by it. The modern Middle Eastern response to Aladdin is neither simple nor unified. It is pride, irritation, nostalgia, critique, affection, frustration, reclamation, all at once. Because Aladdin doesn't belong to one culture anymore. It belongs to every culture that touches it, loves it, questions it, rewrites it. If the Silk Road created the first hybrid Aladdin, and Europe created the second, and Hollywood the third, then the Middle East today is shaping the fourth. A version that sees everything, the flaws, the beauty, the distortions, the possibilities, and chooses to move the story forward anyway. And that brings us to the next question. Why does Aladdin endure? Why do we keep retelling stories about magic and wishes? What do these tales reveal about us? Not culturally, but psychologically. That's where we go next. For thousands of years, humans have told stories about wishes, magic rings, endless treasure, spirits that obey, objects that transform a life overnight. But none of these stories, none, have captivated the human imagination the way the genie story does. And the real question is, why? Why do we cling to wish fulfillment tales across cultures, continents, generations? Why does Aladdin, whether in Baghdad, Paris, London, Hollywood, or Cairo, still feel emotionally universal? To answer that, we have to look inward, not at history, at ourselves. Imagine being a child hearing Aladdin for the first time, a poor boy, a dusty street, a life with no upward path, then suddenly, a lamp, a miracle, a shortcut to a better existence. This taps into one of the deepest psychological impulses we have, the desire for transcendence, to rise above the limitations of our birthplace, our class, our circumstances. In medieval cultures, this was fantasy. In modern America, it's the American dream. Aladdin is simply the fantasy version of the idea that has shaped American culture for centuries. Anyone can rise, anyone can succeed, anyone can transform. Even if reality is far harsher, the myth persists, because we need it. If someone handed you a lamp right now, what would you wish for? Money, health, love, freedom, a second chance, a different past? Psychologists say that humans rarely wish for what they need. We wish for what we believe will fix the hole inside us. Aladdin's wishes aren't random. To be rich, to be admired, to be chosen, to be worthy, to be transformed into someone he already believed he wasn't. Every wish is a confession. And that's why genie stories are compelling, because whether we admit it or not, our deepest desires are not rational. They are emotional survival strategies. We want safety, certainty, belonging, recognition, control, love, and we want them instantly, without cost. That's what the genie represents, the fantasy of pain-free transformation. If genie stories were just about dreams, they would be shallow. But they're not. They are warnings. Across world folklore, wish-granting always comes with consequences. The wish is granted literally, not as intended. The wish reveals selfishness. The wish creates dependency. The wish disrupts the natural order. The wish requires sacrifice. These patterns are ancient psychological truths. Humans often don't know what to do with power. And even when we think we do, we rarely foresee the cost. Aladdin rising too fast isn't victory. It's a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of unearned power. We cheer for him, but part of us knows something is wrong. This tension is why the story endures. It reflects the universal truth that we crave transformation, but we fear what it will turn us into. Look closely at the genie. He is powerful but trapped, friendly but dangerous, compassionate but unpredictable. In many ways, the genie symbolizes the human unconscious. Our impulses, our temptations, our anger, our capacity for self-destruction, our longing for freedom from internal limitations. The three wishes are not rules. They are boundaries, restrictions, attempts to contain the chaos of desire. We don't fear the genie. We fear the part of ourselves that might misuse the genie. This is why even children intuitively understand that wishes can go wrong. The lamp is a mirror. Throughout history, genie tales rise in popularity during periods of economic hardship, political instability, collective anxiety, cultural transition, migration, and displacement. Why? Because when the world feels unpredictable, humans cling to stories of sudden hope. In medieval cities devastated by disease and war, the idea of a miraculous turn of fortune was irresistible. In modern America, where inequality grows, mobility stalls, and dreams feel fragile, genie stories still resonate. Aladdin isn't just nostalgia, it's emotional comfort. A whisper that says, "What if your life could change tomorrow?" Even if we know it won't, even if magic isn't real, the hope itself is the magic. Every version of Aladdin, from Galland to Disney to modern retellings, circles back to a single question. What do you truly want? Not the surface wish, the real one beneath it. Because the wish you choose is a roadmap to your character. If you wish for power, you fear weakness. If you wish for wealth, you fear scarcity. If you wish for love, you fear invisibility. If you wish for freedom, you fear captivity, whether physical or emotional. Genie stories endure because they reveal us to ourselves. The lamp is not magic. The wishes are. Because they show our deepest vulnerabilities, desires, and fears. And that's why Aladdin continues, not as a cultural artifact, not as a historical anomaly, but as a psychological mirror. A reminder that in every era, on every continent, in every heart, we are all still trying to wish our way into the life we imagine. Stories don't stand still. They move, bend, fracture, evolve. Especially stories as globally recognizable as Aladdin. And in the 21st century, the tale is undergoing one of its biggest transformations yet. Not because of a single filmmaker or a single cultural shift, but because the storytelling landscape itself has changed. For the first time in history, millions of creators, not just a handful of Western gatekeepers, have access to the tools to retell a global myth. And Aladdin, a story born from cultural blending, is now being reshaped by the very cultures it once misrepresented. To understand how modern retellings work, we start with the most significant shift, the rise of diverse authors reclaiming narratives once filtered through Orientalist lenses. Across bookstores in the US, the UK, and the Middle East, you'll now find YA novels inspired by Aladdin, but told from perspectives never allowed into the original. Some follow the princess instead of the street boy. Some center Aladdin's mother, transforming her from a one-note background figure into a character with depth, burdens, dreams, and agency. Others dismantle the entire structure, asking, what if the genie didn't want to be rescued? What if the villain wasn't the sorcerer, but the system that created him? And then there are the retellings created by Arab and Middle Eastern authors. These versions feel different, not because they're more accurate, but because they're anchored in lived experience. They depict marketplaces the way people actually remember them. They understand how Arabic jokes work, how family relationships feel, how religion intersects with everyday life without being exoticized or weaponized. These authors aren't trying to fix Aladdin. They're doing what storytellers have always done, taking old stories and making them speak to their own lives. Meanwhile, graphic novels and comics have become fertile ground for experimenting with new visual languages. Some artists draw inspiration from Islamic geometric art, using symmetry and pattern to shape entire worlds. Others lean into modern comic aesthetics, bold color, sharp humor, kinetic action, transforming Aladdin from folklore into superhero myth. But the boldest shift is happening in theater. Not Broadway, though Broadway's Aladdin musical expanded the Disney universe with new songs and extravagant spectacle. The real innovation is happening in smaller contemporary theater spaces, where creators are staging Aladdin as a meta-story about representation itself. Imagine a play where the characters know they're trapped inside an Orientalist narrative. The princess complains she's tired of being treated like a prize. The genie jokes that he's the only one in the cast without a free will clause in his contract. Aladdin wonders why every retelling erases his mother. These productions don't just tell the story. They interrogate it in real time. Even film is shifting again. After decades of Hollywood dominating the global narrative, other industries have stepped in. Bollywood has produced its own Aladdin-inspired films, energetic, romantic, musical, and deeply rooted in Indian cinematic tradition. Turkish and Egyptian studios have produced adaptations that pull the story back into Middle Eastern cultural spheres, reframing it with local humor, regional dialects, and grounded aesthetic choices. And then there's the digital realm. TikTok retellings, YouTube explainer videos, fan fiction universes with hundreds of thousands of readers, interactive role-playing stories where users make Aladdin's choices and watch the consequences unfold. These aren't lowbrow versions. They're the modern oral tradition, the same dynamic process that shaped the Arabian Nights themselves centuries ago. Stories grow stronger when passed between many voices, and today's creators are doing exactly what Galland, Diab, and hundreds of storytellers before them did, remixing the narrative to reflect their own world. But this modern remix comes with new challenges. Creators must walk a tightrope between cultural appreciation and appropriation, especially when retellings are set in fictional Arabian-like worlds that aren't actually Arab or Islamic. Some choose to acknowledge the fantasy origins openly. This isn't real Arabia. This is a world inspired by multiple cultures. Others work painstakingly to build historically grounded settings, consulting scholars and cultural experts to avoid the mistakes of earlier adaptations. Still others abandon cultural specificity entirely, setting the story in purely invented universes, sand kingdoms, floating cities, steam-powered empires, freeing themselves from real-world expectations, but also severing the tale from its cultural roots. There is no single right approach. Every choice has trade-offs. But what matters is the intentionality, the willingness to confront the story's legacy rather than reproduce it blindly. And that is what separates modern retellings from earlier ones. Victorian England reshaped Aladdin for entertainment. Hollywood reshaped it for profit. But modern creators are reshaping it with awareness of history, of representation, of the power stories hold over how cultures see themselves and how the world sees them. And perhaps that's the most fitting evolution for a story born from cultural blending. Aladdin has always belonged to everyone and to no one. But now, for the first time, everyone has a chance to speak back. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, from medieval Baghdad to Victorian England, from French translators to Hollywood sound stages, then you already know the truth. Aladdin was never just a children's story. It was never just about a boy, or a lamp, or a genie bursting out in a cloud of blue smoke. It was, and still is, a mirror. A mirror reflecting who tells the story, who listens to it, and what each era chooses to believe about the world. And the deeper we go, the more we realize something essential. The real magic was never in the lamp. It was in the storytelling. Because storytelling is power. The power to define cultures, the power to misrepresent them, the power to shape how millions of people imagine places they've never seen. When Antoine Galland introduced Aladdin to Europe in 1709, he didn't just translate a tale. He opened a portal, one that allowed Western audiences to dream about the East while simultaneously misunderstanding it. That portal created delight, yes, but it also created stereotypes, assumptions, and ways of seeing the Islamic world that still echo today. Victorian England added humor and spectacle. Hollywood added romance and Broadway-scale magic. Disney added pop culture, color, and charisma. Each era added its desires, its fears, its fantasies. But something interesting happened along the way. The story kept outgrowing the people who shaped it. It kept evolving, kept slipping through the fingers of anyone who tried to own it, kept becoming bigger than any single author, studio, or culture. And that's the paradox at the heart of Aladdin. A story born from cultural hybridity has become a global myth precisely because it refuses to stay in one place. So what do we do with a story like that? A story that has inspired millions yet also perpetuated misunderstanding? A story that has traveled farther than any merchant on the Silk Road? We do the only thing humans have ever done with powerful stories. We learn from them. We question them. We reshape them. We pass them on, but with greater awareness than before. Because now we know the history behind the fantasy. We know the Islamic Golden Age wasn't a world of genies, but of scholars, architects, and astronomers. We know Baghdad's real treasures weren't rubies on trees, but equations, manuscripts, and ideas that shaped global civilization. We know Orientalism wasn't harmless decoration, but a lens that distorted how the West understood the East. And we know modern retellings can give voice to the people the original story overlooked: women, workers, Middle Eastern creators, and cultures that were once flattened into stereotypes. We understand now that representation matters, not because stories must be perfect, but because stories shape the world long after the final page is turned. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Aladdin. Magic is never free. Wishes have consequences. And the stories we tell about others often reveal more about ourselves than we realize. Yet despite all the complexities, all the contradictions, all the problematic elements, there's a reason Aladdin endures. A reason people keep retelling it, defending it, reinventing it. It speaks to something universal: the desire to break free from limitation, the hope that circumstances can change, the belief that even someone invisible to society, a poor boy, a forgotten widow, a powerless figure, can rise, not through birthright, but through imagination. That fantasy isn't trivial, it's human, and it tells us something powerful. The world we inherit isn't fixed. The stories we inherit aren't final. We have the ability and responsibility to rewrite both. As you close your eyes tonight, maybe you'll imagine a cave filled not with gold, but with centuries of human imagination. Each glowing treasure a version of the story told by someone from a different time, a different land, a different world view, and in the center of that cave sits a lamp, not magical, not ancient, but symbolic. A lamp lit by every storyteller who's ever touched Aladdin. A lamp that continues to burn because each generation lights it anew. We don't know who told the first Aladdin story. We don't know who will tell the last. But we do know this. As long as humans dream, as long as they long for transformation, as long as they believe in the possibility of more, the lamp will never go out. And maybe, just maybe, that's the closest thing to real magic we'll ever know. Before you click away, I want to hear from you. Which version of Aladdin shaped your childhood? The book, the stage plays, the Disney films, or something else entirely? And after learning the real history, has your perspective changed? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice is part of this story now, and the conversation doesn't end here. The real lesson behind Aladdin isn't about magic lamps or supernatural wishes. It's about how stories shape the world, and how the world, in turn, reshapes stories. Aladdin teaches us that narratives travel farther than armies, artifacts, or empires. A single tale, mistranslated or reinvented at the right moment, can alter how entire civilizations see one another. Sometimes that influence is beautiful. Sometimes it's harmful. But it always matters. This story reminds us that cultural exchange has always been messy, unpredictable, and deeply human. Ideas cross borders, voices blend, myths evolve, and in that evolution, we can either create understanding or reinforce misunderstanding. The true treasure is not the magic lamp, but the realization that every story we pass on carries responsibility. We can choose to retell tales in ways that honor the people they represent, challenge old stereotypes, and deepen our connection to the world. Aladdin survived for more than 300 years not because of magic, but because it reflects what we dream about: freedom, transformation, possibility, and the belief that even the smallest life can ignite something extraordinary. If we understand the past, we can write better stories for the future. And that may be the greatest wish of all.